War. I got a 2-minute commercial about who we are, who's coming on this program. We made it a point to bring other people in. So Rich Jankowski from Old Baldy Civil War Roundtable is one of the hosts. The Inland Empire, I'm sorry, I start again. General Meade Society is one of the hosts. And then who is co-hosting our programs and gets the bottom line in all our programs is Bucks County Civil War. So we're not in competition on everybody. We just feel important that we all work together. Okay, who we are. Okay, we present reading educational programs about the Civil War that examine its causes, military, political, society aspects, and lasting legacy. We're proud to say we already had 2 Pulitzer Prize winners. James McPherson spoke several times before our group. Eric Foner. We've had names like Craig Simons, Bud Robertson, a whole host of pretty strong names. And okay, now let me just go to our speaker itself, Jennifer Murray. I heard her speak at one of the Andy Watsky's either GAR or I think it was a GAR meeting, and she was part of a symposium that morning. And I asked her to speak before our group. So let me tell you who it is. Dr. Jennifer Murray is a military historian with a specialization in the American Civil War and Department of History at Oklahoma State University. Murray's most recent publication is On a Great Battlefield, The Making of Management and Memory of Gettysburg. Okay. She's also author of Civil War Begins, published by the U.S. Army Center of Military History in 2012. She's currently working on a full-length biography of General George Meade, tentatively entitled Meade at War. She delivered hundreds of Civil War battlefield tours. She led World War I and World War II study abroad, and she's a veteran faculty member at Gettysburg College Civil War Institute and a coveted speaker at Civil War symposiums and roundtables. I want to point out, we just crossed 100, I said so. One of the things with Professor Murray, I get her compliments after the program's over. And to me, that's really a wonderful thing. And I'm so glad. Now, before we get started, she will be on, has a conflict. So for all of you listening, the program will be the 5th, February 29th. You can't forget that, February 29th. And I'm pleased to, let's see, I saw her on before, but I'm having a problem with my thing. So let me just, Professor Murray, you're on.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction, and I'm hopeful you can all see my PowerPoint slide up on this screen. I'm thrilled to be invited back. I talked to you all, I think it was twice last year, in addition to that talk about that was co-hosted, I think, by the Union League and the Old Baldy Society that Andy Waskey organized initially, I think, where Rich sort of discovered me, if you will. And then I did a talk for you all on Meade, sort of broadly his career. And then I think in March, I did something on Meade and the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. So that to say, I'm thrilled to be back with you all tonight. And I'm happy to see such a healthy turnout on the Zoom screen tonight. Gives me a lot of kind of an encouragement and uplift that people are still interested in George Meade. The Zoom fatigue hasn't worn us down completely yet. And kudos to you all for establishing these partnerships with other roundtables. It's a great way to coordinate and reinforce and uplift one another to continue these discussions about the Civil War. Also, y'all, thank you for the accommodation on the schedule in February. We are back in school. Spring term here at Oklahoma State just started last week, and I teach on Thursday nights. So I just finished up a conversation. I'm teaching a U.S. military history class on Thursday nights. I just finished up talking about the French and Indian War and the Edward Braddock expedition and the Battle of Monongahela. Wrapped up with them early, and now I'm going to jump in to talk about 1864 stuff with you all. So it's been a good evening for me to talk about stuff I'm interested in and spend a lot of time researching here. So Rich pitched to me an idea, or maybe I pitched it to him, or we both pitched it at the same time, at least, to kind of continue this discussion about George Meade's career, this Winter of Meade kind of part two, a continuation from last year. So what I want to do tonight is talk with you all about George Meade, Ulysses S. Grant, and the Overland Campaign. Then next month, February 29, I want to talk with you about Meade and his leadership at the Petersburg Campaign. So tonight we'll look at early May until Meade and the Army of the Potomac cross the James River in June. Then we'll pick up with that discussion next month. This is a perfect image to start. A perfect image for a cover slide, if you will, the iconic Meade and Grant combination with Meade's headquarters flag, which I'll tell you a little bit about that here in a couple slides, sort of symbolizing this 1864 on to Richmond quest. The title of my talk, the quote at least, it would be "Injurious to the Army to have two heads," comes from a letter that Meade wrote to his wife on May 19, 1864. So what I hope to do tonight, what I hope you take away from this talk, is a better understanding, a little bit more nuance of how the partnership between Grant and Meade functioned during the Overland Campaign. Maybe have a little bit more nuance to this notion that Meade is relegated to a secondary role. The primary sources do not support that at all. And hopefully understand and have an appreciation for all the challenges that Meade is going to deal with from being under Grant's purview to managing a really contested group, controversial, irascible group of subordinates in the Army of the Potomac, and some of the other factors that he has to collaborate with, other generals that he has to work with. I thought a good point of departure, with that said, would be to look at a sampling of how historians have treated Meade or written about him in regards to the Overland Campaign. And I wanted to pick at least two scholars that have written about Meade and Grant in the Overland Campaign to just give you a little flavor of what the literature says, what the secondary sources say. Some of you might be familiar with both of these scholars. Brooks Simpson is arguably the nation's leading historian on Ulysses S. Grant. He's a professor at Arizona State. He's written numerous books on Grant, Reconstruction in the Civil War. And in his Grant biography, Brooks Simpson writes, by entrusting matters to Meade, in this context, he's specifically talking about Spotsylvania, Grant had taken a risk. Despite Meade's best efforts, the results again highlighted his shortcomings in conducting offensive operations. Gordon Ray, the other two quotes on the screen, no doubt you're familiar with Gordon Ray's work. He's an attorney, a prolific writer on the Civil War, and indisputably, his works on the Overland Campaign are the best that we have. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, his North Anna book, his Cold Harbor book, they're magisterial. But it is no surprise for those of you who've read Gordon Ray's work that he is consistently and passionately critical of Meade and his performance in 1864. Regarding Meade at Spotsylvania on the 12th, Gordon Ray writes that Meade had been reduced to little more than a staff officer responsible for ensuring the Army of the Potomac's compliance with Grant's orders. He continues on in his Spotsylvania book, and he described Meade as a cautious soldier, that Grant's agenda of bold maneuvers and assaults came as a profound shock to him. And generally, this is the theme for Gordon Ray, his an interpretive thread through all of his Overland Campaign books, that Meade is reduced to a supporting role, staff officer, secondary, tertiary role. And by and large, when we look at 1864, we frame the war in Virginia as a contest between Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. After Meade's success at Gettysburg, we basically ignore him in the narrative, or to the extent that he's discussed at all, it is as an afterthought or as a subordinate, a tertiary character to Grant and his larger plans. I hope by the time we wrapped up tonight that I will have made a convincing argument, because the primary source evidence is pretty clear, that Meade's role in the Overland Campaign is enormous. It's profound. And he is absolutely more than a staff officer and plays a bigger role than being relegated to a secondary or tertiary position. That's the narrative thread through tonight. I thought a good place to start then, rather than just jump right into the Overland Campaign, is with a couple comments by way of background. Makes sense to start here. Late February 1864, U.S. Congress will reinvigorate the rank of Lieutenant General, previously and last time held by George Washington, and bestow it upon Ulysses S. Grant. Grant, as we know, will be commander of all Union armies, but he will decide to make his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac. He will meet Major General George Meade in mid-March 1864 in Culpeper County. And Meade writes about this in his letters. He writes about this first meeting. It's a rainy, kind of miserable spring day. And he explains to his wife, Margaretta, that he expected Grant would prefer someone to command the Army of the Potomac that he was familiar with, that Grant would bring someone from the Western Theater and put him in to command the Army of the Potomac, move Meade into some other role. Meade fully expects that this will be happening, so he's a bit surprised when Grant decides to retain him as commander of the Army of the Potomac. It's the right decision. Meade is intimately familiar with this army. He's commanded it since June 28th, 1863. He served in it since August of 1861, and by any measure has had a successful career in the Army of the Potomac. So one thing that we're going to have to tackle tonight is how Meade functions under Grant's authority. How Meade himself, I'm writing a biography on Meade, so I'm looking at this relationship through his eyes, sees his role. And I wanted to share two quotes with you to get us started in thinking about that dynamic. About 4 or 5 weeks after that initial meeting with Grant, Meade will write a sequence of letters back home to Margaretta in Philly, his wife. And he shares with her some of his views and thoughts on this new command relationship. Here on April the 13th, Meade says, "I have no doubt he will give me all the credit I am entitled to. The press and perhaps the public will lose sight of me in him." That is absolutely what happens. That prophecy comes to fruition. The second quote, shared from a letter on the 26th, Meade says, "You say, and it is true, I am working for Grant, but I say I am working for the cause and for the country, and it is my duty to do all I can to advance that cause." Now imagine the situation. And maybe we can feel a little bit of sympathy or empathy for Meade right from the outset, that your superior, your boss, decides to make his headquarters with you. So Meade fully realizes before the army crosses over and starts the Overland Campaign that he is in Grant's shadow. However, the relationship between these two men, between Grant and Meade, is constantly evolving. And that's something when I started my sequence of chapters on the Overland Campaign. I have a chapter on the wilderness, I have one on Spotsylvania, I have one on North Anna. It's very clear that the relationship is never static, meaning sometimes Grant will give Meade more latitude during a battle, more tactical authority, more command authority. But then sometimes Grant does micromanage Meade, and he will specifically write out orders, what he wants for the army, let's say, to march to Spotsylvania. He will itemize it. This corps does this, takes this road. Sometimes he is much more heavy-handed in managing Meade. So it's a relationship that has a tremendous amount of give and take to it and evolution to it. It's not one thing consistently. But I will encourage you to think about this. The relationship between these two men, I'm going to flip back. These two men is one of, if not the, most successful partnerships in the entire Civil War. George Meade will willingly submit himself to Grant's authority for the productive outcome of the Army of the Potomac and the Union war effort. And let's not lose sight in that. I don't know, and you can debate this, these are fun conversations to have, that any other prior commander of the Army of the Potomac could have worked as productively with Grant as Meade did. Could you imagine, for instance, George McClellan working under Grant's authority? Of course not. Joseph Hooker under Grant's authority? Of course not. Maybe Burnside? I don't know. But Meade's commitment to duty, back to that quote on the 26th, he's going to grumble about being under Grant's authority, of course, but he does his job. So rather than seeing the relationship between Grant and Meade as adversarial, as I think Gordon Ray casts it, I think we should look at it as being one that's incredibly productive. It's incredibly productive. And frankly, there's a lot going on for George Meade in March and April 1864. So before we jump into the Overland Campaign, let's take a moment and think about the composition of the Army of the Potomac. This is an army that has changed dramatically since Meade took command of it in June of 1863. The top sequence of images is the Army of the Potomac Corps commanders the day before the Battle of Gettysburg begins. 7 infantry corps that will fight and win the Battle of Gettysburg under Meade's leadership, bringing the Army of the Potomac the most successful victory in its history to that time. That is not the Army of the Potomac that starts the Overland Campaign. And let's not minimize that, or let's not ignore that. The Army of the Potomac undergoes a series of reorganizations, a serious reorganization in the spring of 1864, and that is after the 11th Corps, commanded by Oliver Otis Howard, and the 12th Corps, commanded by Henry Slocum, are sent west in the fall of 1863. Then, at the outset of the Overland Campaign, the Army of the Potomac will be reorganized. It's compressed and units are amalgamated so that when this Overland Campaign starts, the Army of the Potomac consists of 3 corps. You have the 2nd Corps commanded by General Winfield Scott Hancock. Hancock never recovers from the wound sustained at Gettysburg on July the 2nd. He is never going to be fully healthy. He is Meade's most trusted subordinate, but he's never 100% again. Second Corps commander. Fifth Corps commander is the guy here in the middle, Gouverneur K. Warren. Warren, of course, is the topographical engineer, the chief engineer that realizes Little Round Top is abandoned on July the 2nd. He gets bumped initially to command the Second Corps and then transferred over to the Fifth Corps. We'll talk about him a bit tonight because he's going to be, frankly, problematic for General Meade. Then the Sixth Corps, at the beginning of the Overland Campaign and at least through the early phases of the Battle of Spotsylvania, is commanded by John Sedgwick, Uncle John. He, as you know, falls mortally wounded at Spotsylvania, and he will be replaced by Horatio Wright, who's competent but not inspiring. Off in the circles here on the periphery of my screen are other factors that Meade will have to deal with. The Army of the James, commanded by General Ben Butler, is operating in Virginia, and the 18th Corps, commanded by Baldy Smith, will at times cooperate or collaborate with the Army of the Potomac. Meade and Smith do not get along, and they had not got along even before the war began. Then throw into the mix Ambrose Burnside. We're going to talk about him tonight too, and we'll really talk about him next week. But he's commanding the Army. He's commanding the 9th Corps, which initially is not part of the Army of the Potomac, but will be folded into it later. So I give you all that to say, this is not the Gettysburg Army of the Potomac. The people commanding the corps are different, some of them inexperienced, and frankly, some of them people whom Meade just does not get along with them. Not to add to the mess of the Army or some of its limitations, but the 3-year enlistments are starting to expire. There's a bit of a crisis for re-enlistment in the Army of the Potomac this spring. Some of the veteran units, like the Pennsylvania Reserves, actually, those men deciding their duty to the Union is over and they are going home. So it's the composition, the demographic of this Army is very different. And it's about to undergo the bloodiest campaign that it has yet to see. The bloodiest campaign that it is yet to see. On the left is a map, a good overview of the Overland Campaign. The objective, of course, to get to Richmond, the Confederate capital, here in the center, by flanking maneuvers, kind of leapfrogging Grant and Meade in the blue. On the 9th, Grant will issue orders to Meade very simply. Your army, Lee's army will be your objective point. Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also. I want to mention, since some of you are members of the Old Baldy Roundtable, you might know this. If not, you might find it interesting. Old Baldy, Meade's trusted warhorse, wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg on the 2nd. Meade tries to nurse him back to full capacity, such as it were, but at the beginning of the Overland Campaign, Meade is worried that Old Baldy just isn't up to the rigors or the task ahead of him. So he's going to have Old Baldy sent back to Philly, basically puts Old Baldy in retirement in a farmstead outside of Philly at Jenkintown. Meade will check in on Old Baldy at times. He writes letters asking for updates about how Old Baldy is doing, or to Old Baldy's caretaker. And I just wanted to share this with you because it's connected to you guys, some of you at least, the Old Baldy Roundtable, and because I think it shows a humanistic part of Meade that we sometimes overlook in this urge to label him a snapping turtle. We forget these moments of compassion and humanism. Here Meade's writing in September of 64, post-Overland Campaign, but the sentiment's important. He says, I told Mrs. Meade I wanted to have the old horse in somebody's hands who knew something about him. It would not let him be ill used. And I felt sure if you could look after him, you would. If he continues to improve and the war lasts, I may bring him onto the field next spring. Well, old Baldy's health doesn't allow him to come back and join the campaign again in service to Meade and the nation. Meade writes a lot about old Baldy, thinks about him, various letters. Continuing on that one, he says, Mrs. Meade writes me that you have kindly consented to receive old Baldy at your place, and I hasten to express to you my very great thanks. The old fellow was wounded in the flank at Second Bull Run, shot through the neck at Antietam, and at Gettysburg had a ball pass through the saddle, went into his body, where it has remained ever since. I kept him with me till this spring in hopes he would recover, but fear he might be an embarrassment on the campaign to Philadelphia just before we crossed the river, the Rapidan. Old Baldy leaves the Army of the Potomac on the 24th of April. So the Army of the Potomac crosses the Rapidan River on May the 5th. Here's an Edwin Forbes sketch. Just under 100,000 men, and if you add Burnside and the Ninth Corps to it, you get up to about 119,000. Meade will cross on the 4th of May, about 9:30 in the morning at Germanna Ford. And I mentioned to you on that cover slide when I showed you Grant and Meade, and I mentioned the headquarters flag. This is the point in the story where you get the famous quote or the quip from Grant where he says, "What's this? Is Imperial Caesar anywhere about here?" Grant, apparently riding around to Meade's headquarters that morning, sees this sulfurno color, not quite red, not quite magenta, but something in between, sulfurno, swallowtail flag. Incredibly elaborate. Meade had adopted this new headquarters flag. And this quote comes from Alfred Woad, who writes about it in Battles and Leaders. What's this? Is Imperial Caesar anywhere about here? So that's the flag that you see on that rendering on my cover slide. You know the narrative of the Overland Campaign. You know that it begins with a signature battle at the Wilderness. It's a 2-day fight that will see about 17,000 casualties for the Army of the Potomac. I don't want to get into all the tactical details of the battles of the Overland Campaign. I want to look at them through why or how they matter to Meade or how Meade performs in them, which is how I'm handling it in my work in my book on Meade. This is a confusing battle anyway. The Wilderness, the terrain, incredibly rugged, the underbrush. It's a miserable place to try to march an army through, much less to try to fight a battle there. The distinguishing features of this area, if y'all have been to the Wilderness, you know this, just sort of imagine in your mind's eye, are the road networks. Orange Turnpike, the Germanna Plank Road, Orange Turnpike over here beyond the Wilderness, and then Orange Plank Road. This fight opens in the morning on May the 5th, about 7:15. Meade is going to encounter an aide from Governor K. Warren's staff who will report that he has run into some skirmishers, ultimately from Ewell's Corps. And this is the fighting over here at Saunders Field. You can see it on the map. This is going to be the origins of some problems with Warren. And when we look at Governor K. Warren, our tendency is to focus on what a superb job he does at Gettysburg. The hero, the savior, Little Round Top, the statue that stands on Little Round Top today for his fight and his service on July 2nd, 1863. But if you continue to trace Warren's career forward through ultimately his relief or being dismissed from command, it's kind of checkered. And for me, writing on Meade, this is a subordinate that Meade will consistently struggle to manage. Warren has a tendency to question orders, and rather than implement them unquestionably, he will get orders here at Saunders Field, at Laurel Hill, at the fight at Spotsylvania, and he tends to want to interpret them and implement them as he sees fit. So his relationship with Meade in the Overland Campaign is going to be one that's volatile and contentious. And remember, he's the Army's 5th Corps commander. And say what we will about him, but he's been in command of a corps since August. So he does bring seniority and continuity to the corps command level, particularly after Sedgwick falls mortally wounded. I wanted to share with you a thought from Ulysses S. Grant in terms of how much latitude he gives to Meade during the Overland Campaign. I thought it would be helpful to look at Grant's own words. The official report on the Overland Campaign, he pens, "I tried as far as possible to leave General Meade in independent command of the Army of the Potomac. My instructions for that army," and this is important, "were all through him and were general in their nature, leaving all the details and the execution to him." That's not acting as a staff officer. That's a relationship at the Wilderness in which Meade has a fair amount of autonomy to command the tactical minutia of the Battle of the Wilderness. The fight, May 5th, 6th, and then finally, as the Army starts to move on the 7th. If you want to consider this a victory for Lee, that's certainly fair. It's an inhospitable environment for the Army of the Potomac. They struggle to coordinate, back to the map. The two flanks, Hancock sort of acts down here in isolation, never really coordinating with the Sedgwick and Warren, the 5th and 6th Corps. This is going to be a theme the entire way through the Overland Campaign. Incredibly poor coordination. And finally, terrain there is not conducive to fight a battle. You just kind of got bogged down. Grant is going to instruct Meade to move forward, make all preparations for a night march to take a position at Spotsylvania with one Army Corps. 10 miles south of the Wilderness is Spotsylvania. Grant is hoping to interpose the Army of the Potomac between Richmond and Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. That's his objective. Get to the road junction at Spotsylvania and interpose between Lee and Richmond. So off the Army of the Potomac goes. The one factor we haven't talked about yet, I mentioned Burnside briefly and I mentioned Baldy Smith briefly. We haven't talked about Sheridan. He's going to be an element for Meade that is also contentious. Sheridan, this is a new command dynamic for him. Sheridan is 33 years old, and here at the Overland Campaign, he's standing here in the center. There's going to be a pretty volatile explosion on May the 8th between Sheridan and Meade. And what they argue over is the role of the Federal cavalry. On May 8th, so one day after Grant issues that order to start to move to Spotsylvania, at Army headquarters, Meade and Sheridan get into a pretty impassioned debate. Meade wants Sheridan to take Federal cavalry and use them in a capacity to conduct reconnaissance. That's basically how he used Alfred Pleasanton. He wants Sheridan to be part of headquarters staff, Federal troopers, conduct reconnaissance, a little bit of picket duty. That's your role, rather limited. Sheridan has a bigger, bolder agenda. Sheridan wants Federal cavalry to go out and fight the enemy's troopers. Sheridan wants the latitude to go out and conduct his own operations. So they get into this dispute on May the 8th. Meade doesn't write about it, but Theodore Lyman, his aide, does, and Sheridan does in his memoirs. And we get pretty vivid accounts about this. It must have just been a firestorm exchange. Lyman writes that Meade, quote, worked himself into a towering passion. Well, we know Meade's temperamental, volatile, but so is Sheridan. And Sheridan, as Lyman tells it, used language that was conspicuously italicized with expletives. Sheridan's giving it right back to Meade, insubordinate. And in the end, Sheridan gets frustrated and he says, fine, if you want to command the federal cavalry, you go ahead and command it, Meade. And what's interesting about this exchange, it's often recounted, but it's interesting that Meade kind of backs down. He de-escalates the conversation. He goes up to Sheridan, he puts his hand on his shoulder, and he says, no, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that at all. Sheridan's not going to be ameliorated or pacified, and Sheridan storms out of Meade's headquarters. Meade, stewing over the matter, goes to Grant, and whether he wants just a friendly ear or to vent, who knows, but he retells Grant the story, this exchange he just had with Sheridan. And Grant basically says, oh, that's interesting. Sheridan said that. That sounds like a good idea. Unleash Sheridan. And Grant tells Meade to unleash Sheridan on his own independent operations. So later in the day on May the 8th, Meade will write orders that take Sheridan and 12,000 federal cavalrymen off on their own independent operation. And in that instance, Grant undermined Meade's preference or authority. So when the Army of the Potomac starts to move towards Spotsylvania, there is no horsemen, reconnaissance, the eyes and the ears, assessing the roads, pushing the strength of the enemy. The Army of the Potomac stumbles to Spotsylvania, hamstrung or blind, hamstrung at best, blind at worst. And here they are. Here's Spotsylvania, the crossroads 10 miles south of the Wilderness. This is where, on May the 9th, Sedgwick will fall mortally wounded. I suspect you're familiar with the story. They can't hit an elephant at that distance. Pretty powerful painting here done in 1887. Sedgwick's loss means that Horatio Wright will command the Sixth Corps. And for Meade, he writes about the death of John Sedgwick that day. He says, I feel more grieved at his death because we had not parted entirely in good feelings. Meade had had sharp words for Sedgwick in his performance at the Battle of the Wilderness. So his last conversation with Sedgwick was rather critical of his performance at the Wilderness. You know that the fight at Spotsylvania, the big assault, happens on May the 12th. It's preluded by an attack on May the 10th. If you're a fan of Emory Upton, this is his moment here, attacking the Confederate earthworks, trying to break their line. He has a little bit of success, but not enough to break Lee's entrenchments. Grant likes the idea of a column assault, so on May the 12th, he takes Upton's idea and just kind of expands the strength and the scope of it, and he uses the entire Second Corps, about 20,000 men, Hancock's Corps, to try to break the Muleshoe salient. And this, as you know, the assault begins about 4 o'clock in the morning. They're attacking a position held by Edward Johnson, his Confederates, and for about 24 hours, pretty much consistently, hand-to-hand, fierce, ferocious fighting here at the Muleshoe salient, and at a devastating loss for the Army of the Potomac. Federals will lose about 9,000 men here on May the 12th. And it's disproportionately those casualties fall to the Second Corps, disproportionately so. Some of Meade's leadership questions at Spotsylvania center again around Warren and cooperation, or being able to move your corps simultaneously. This is the long-standing trouble that they can't quite do. They can't quite coordinate 2nd, 5th Corps to attack simultaneously. And here again, Warren, who is off at Laurel Hill, is receiving orders to push the 5th Corps in, try to take the pressure off the 2nd, and Warren is interpreting them as he sees fit. And he's not moving with the kind of alacrity that Meade would like. So Ulysses S. Grant authorizes Meade, here's the quote, "If Warren fails to attack promptly, send Humphreys to command his corps and relieve him." Meade had already delegated Humphreys, his chief of staff, Major General Andrew A. Humphreys, basically to oversee Warren. Warren and Humphreys know each other from Corps of Engineers, seems like a smart thing to do. So he has like his eyes and ears through Humphreys on Warren, but Warren doesn't perform any better at Spotsylvania. And this recalcitrance that Warren exhibits will continue to be problematic for him and for Meade through the next couple months. We'll talk about this next month when we do Petersburg, but come mid-June, Meade will draft orders to relieve Warren of command. He's just fed up with him. He doesn't file them, as you know, but he's so infuriated with Warren that he just doesn't think he can work with him productively any longer. Meade's frustrated with Warren. In fact, it's pretty well known throughout Army headquarters. This is Theodore Lyman. The general's getting more and more discontented with Warren. Grant says, he says this in his memoirs, that had Meade fallen mortally wounded commanding the Army of the Potomac, he would have replaced Meade with Warren. But Warren's behavior made Grant reconsider that. Maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A, but Warren's an effective staff officer. How well he performs as a corps commander, we might think about. But for Meade, he's a problem, frankly. There's very little harmony between those two. 9,000 casualties on May the 12th, and Spotsylvania ends up as a bloody setback for the Army of the Potomac. Grant's objective not realized. And it's going to be clear that the on to Richmond version, 1864, is going to be a long and bloody road. Grant's ramming his head, the Army of the Potomac, in these futile frontal assaults against an entrenched position. I wanted to share this with you. The close call of General Meade on May the 14th. This is the Alfred Woad sketch. Meade and Horatio Wright are out doing a reconnaissance on Myers Hill. It's an obscure part of the Spotsylvania battlefield, if you will. The view shed is obscure. It's wooded, very dense, and they are nearly captured by some enemy cavalry. Meade and Horatio Wright are ferried back to safety. Meade, by some accountings, temporarily is sort of falls off of his horse, or at least is grabbed off of his horse by some Virginia cavalrymen. He loses his spectacles in the process, so it's a bit of a close call. And a newspaper reports it, the Bangor Daily Whig and Courier, General Meade narrowly escapes capture, and writes about Meade and Wright being out doing reconnaissance, escaping just by the skin of their teeth. That's a famous moment for Meade in the Overland Campaign. I have two slides next. I'm watching my time here, so we make sure we get to Cold Harbor. I have two slides next. I want to give you a sense, too, about command dynamic with Grant. There's an article that's published in the United States Service Magazine by a writer down here on the bottom left named Henry Copey. And he writes about the Meade-Grant relationship. It's quoted here on the screen. He says, the gallant Army of the Potomac, directed by Grant, commanded by Meade, and led by Hancock, Sedgwick, and Warren, is to add new laurels to those immortals, bays, which have been watered by the best blood of its noblest heroes. This article is in Meade's hands at least by May 19, because Meade writes about reading it to Margaretta. And he likes how Copey explained the command dynamic. He likes the directed by Grant, commanded by Meade bit. He writes to Margaretta and he says, my top line here, he says, Copey, quote, hit the nail on the head. He's pleased with this portrayal, directed by Grant, commanded by Meade. I'm curious, as I write this book, obviously Meade's letters are the backbone to my chapters. The war as he experienced it, wrote about it, thought about it, felt about it. But I've also been very diligent in reading through soldier letters because I want to know what men in the Army of the Potomac say about Meade. What they say about Meade in the Overland Campaign. John W. Chase, 1st Massachusetts Light Artillery, May 20. Generals Grant and Meade have been very busy. I have seen them most every day, and I am one of the kind that believes as much praise is due to Meade as there is to Grant. So whatever he saw of Meade and Grant, he felt that Meade was leading the Army actively and competently. If you have not yet picked up a copy of the Chase letters, I put the cover of the book here, Yours for the Union. It is wonderful. It's a wonderful soldier's perspective of the Army of the Potomac. Chase generally is favorable to Meade. Let's do the Battle of North Anna. I have just a couple comments I wanted to make on this one, then we'll get to Cold Harbor. Gordon Ray has an entire book on North Anna. It's more of a campaign, it's a maneuver, less a battle, but this is really of Grant's design. Grant doesn't want another Spotsylvania, another frontal assault against an entrenched position is going to be futile. So he's going to try to maneuver. And Grant decides to put the Army of the Potomac across the North Anna River. Meade will oppose this. And as it turns out, it was not a great idea because Lee will manipulate his army in the shape, very famously, Gordon Ray writes, his book on this is just terrific, in the shape of an inverted V. And the Army of the Potomac gets kind of hung out or strung out at the North Anna River. So they move south, and then ultimately they're going to move back. And North Anna is a bit of an abandoned campaign, one that Meade never had confidence in to begin with. This is the time of the war where Timothy O'Sullivan captures that famous Council of War image of Meade and Grant at the Massaponax Church on the 21st. He takes a handful of photos. Here's Grant and Meade. You can visit that part of Virginia today. This is what the Massaponax Church looks like. This would have taken the Army of the Potomac into Caroline County. And as I mentioned, it's a maneuver that Meade, from the beginning, did not support. Marcina Patrick recorded this. West Point classmate of Meade's, as you recall, Provost Marshal. Meade was opposed to our crossing the North Anna. Grant ordered it over his head. This period in the Overland Campaign for Meade is really, he's really melancholy. Reading his letters gives you the sense that he's becoming more and more despondent or frustrated. He doesn't quite see himself having the autonomy and command that he wants. His relationship with Grant kind of ebbs and flows. He talks again about retiring. Here he is on May the 23rd. If there was any honorable way of retiring from my present false position, I would undoubtedly adopt it. False position. What an important phrase. But there is none. And all I can do is to submit and bear with resignation the humiliation. That was a tough letter for Meade. He continues, he writes at length on the 23rd. Now he specifically gets into Grant. He says, I don't think he's a very magnanimous man, but I believe he is above any littleness, and whatever injustice is done me, it is idle to deny that my position is a very unjust one. So he's struggling to situate himself in this dynamic Meade-Grant relationship. And we think a lot about Lee, Stonewall Jackson. I just saw someone pop in the comments about World War II, Patton Eisenhower, right? Other relationships like that. Meade's struggling to navigate it. Then, let's throw this into the mix. At the outset of the Overland Campaign, the 9th Corps, commanded by Major General Ambrose Burnside, is an independent corps. Now on the 24th, Grant is going to put Burnside under Meade's command. Recall that Burnside is senior in rank. Recall that at the Battle of Fredericksburg, when Burnside is Army commander, Meade commands a division. So this is a relationship that is bound to be difficult for both men. Burnside, at this point at least, cheerfully submits to it. He says, it's an excellent order. It's a military necessity. I'm glad it's been issued. James Biddle, who is on Meade's staff, Pennsylvanian, he says, Burnside has been put under the command of General Meade. You do not want anything stronger to show you the way that Grant appreciates Meade. This partnership between Burnside and Meade will last for about 2 months. And then after the Battle of the Crater, which we will do next month, Meade decides he can't work with Burnside any longer, and he's going to ask him to be relieved of command. Virtually every subordinate in the Overland Campaign and the Petersburg Campaign, Meade is going to have a row with. He's going to have some dispute with all of them. Infantry, Burnside, and again, cavalry, Sheridan. Same day that Burnside is amalgamated into the Army of the Potomac, there's a famous incident at Mount Carmel Church. And I'll just give you a short comment on this, then we'll move to Cold Harbor and watching my watch. At the same time that the Army of the Potomac's just plowing through Virginia in these bloody battles and campaigns, operations, the war is escalating in the West. And on May 24, a dispatch comes from Sherman exclaiming what great success they're having against the Confederate armies in the West. It arrives to Mount Carmel Church. Meade is there, some other officers, and so is Charles Dana. Dana is this guy sitting here that for the life of me, I cannot really figure out what purpose he serves in the Overland Campaign. Now, I'm being hyperbolic. I know what purpose he serves, but my goodness, this guy really does not like Meade, and he helps shape that perception of Meade in Washington. Dana asks that the message be read aloud because he knows that it's going to insult Meade and it's going to make the Western armies look more competent and successful than the Army of the Potomac. So it's read aloud. Here's what Theodore Lyman describes Meade's reaction. The eyes of Major General George Gordon Meade stood out about 1 inch as he said, in a voice like cutting an iron with a handsaw, Sir, I consider that dispatch an insult to the Army I command and to me personally. The Army of the Potomac does not require General Grant's inspiration or anyone else's to make it fight. Lyman writes that Meade's eyes grew like a rattlesnake's. He's furious at the insult. He's furious that this was read aloud and made to feel like he and the Army of the Potomac were any less successful than Sherman. Lyman writes that Meade will gripe about this for the rest of the night. He just can't let it go. So I give you that example to say there's a lot of pressures on Meade. There's a lot of internal and external factors at play here. So let's get to Cold Harbor. What's interesting about Cold Harbor, in history, this comes down to us as Grant's assault. The bloody fight at Cold Harbor is Grant, evidence of his butchery, but it is clear in the official records that the idea to attack the Confederate line at Cold Harbor is that of George Meade's. So in the red Confederate position, I'll show you a couple images. Frontal assault towards the Confederate line. Here's Meade on June the 1st, writing to Margaretta. I wish I could go home and be quiet. I never desired fame and was content to live tranquilly with you and our dear children. You know how dearly I love you all, and all my happiness is centered in my dear children. So Cold Harbor is escalating. The tempo of it is picking up. The Overland Campaign is picking up. Newspapers are writing about the Overland Campaign. Newspapers are recording the successes and the setback of the Army of the Potomac. And I want to mention here, then we'll actually do the battle. In the beginning, when Meade says that second slide that I showed you about I will be lost in him, that's absolutely true. The press, as they cover the Army of the Potomac, frames their articles, their editorials, their headlines as a battle and a war between Grant and Lee. You can pick any Northern newspaper, look at the headlines, look at the banners, Grant, 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 Grant. Meade is relatively absent from any of the newspaper reporting. New York Herald, May 24, Grant, splendid condition of the Army of the Potomac. New York Daily Herald, May 31st, General Grant, mentioned again. Meade writes about this, June 1st. The papers are giving Grant all the credit of what they call success. I hope they will remember this if anything goes wrong. I took one New York Daily newspaper as an example, and I looked through like the first 4 pages of it, and Grant's name is mentioned just on an average day 24, 25, 26 times on an average day. Meade, literally not mentioned at all. Once, twice. So he knows. Meade's getting ignored. I'll tell you why in a second. This is James Biddle. I do not want to detract from General Grant, but it sickens me the way that General Meade is being ignored. So June the 1st, the same day that he wrote that letter to Margaretta that I just shared with you, Meade is thinking about an attack against the Confederate line. And he really wants the 6th Corps to spearhead this attack. He writes to Horatio Wright at 10 o'clock, 10:10. This is in the official records. If we give them any time, they will dig so as to prevent any advance on our part. So Meade realizes we got to attack quick before the Confederates have a chance to entrench. Let's strike them now before they can strengthen their position. And what he wants at Cold Harbor is an attack between the 2nd, the 6th, and the 18th Corps. The 2nd Corps has been bloodied since Spotsylvania. North Anna, they're heavily involved in that maneuver. They're late getting onto the battlefield at Cold Harbor, so Grant advises that the attack at Cold Harbor be postponed. It was supposed to happen on the 2nd. Army's not quite ready for a big offensive, so it's postponed 14 hours. Ideally, to give the Army of the Potomac time to do reconnaissance, get situated, 2nd Corps to rest, then attack. Those intervening 14 hours give the Confederates time to do what, y'all? To strengthen their lines. They're going to dig in, they're going to fortify, and make good use of those 14 hours. So on June the 3rd, the bloody offensive frontal assault at Cold Harbor will be made. And without question, Cold Harbor is George Meade's attack. It is his day to command. Grant is relatively inconspicuous or absent on the battlefield on June the 3rd. It is Meade's day. Grant will come on the battlefield about 7 o'clock in the morning. He writes this message I've shared with you. He knows from missives that he's received from Meade and others, the attack is not breaking the Confederate line. It's being costly. It's ineffective. So at 7 o'clock, Grant authorizes Meade to cancel it. Suspend the offensive. If it does not succeed, suspend it. Later, after he sends that message, Grant appears on the battlefield. It's around 11 o'clock, probably. He shows up on the battlefield, and rather than go directly to where Meade had made his headquarters, Grant goes to the field, and he talks with the corps commanders. And he gets the consensus from them that further assaults against Cold Harbor would be futile, needless, senseless loss of life. So after that field council of war, Grant will direct Meade to suspend the attack. So at 12:30, he says, the opinion of corps commanders not being optimistic for success, you may suspend further advance for the present. And the offensive at Cold Harbor costs the Union Army over 4,000 men. It is Meade's assault. We look at it through Grant's lens, and he says very famously in his memoirs, he says, I've always regretted that last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made. He doesn't say that he regrets the assault at Cold Harbor was made. He says he regrets the last assault was ever made. So I know I'm past my time. Let me leave you with a couple quick thoughts. One problem that Meade has, Warren, subordinates, Sheridan, their problems in the Overland Campaign. Navigating his position relative to Grant, has to figure that out. One problem he has is with the press. And I said about how he's being ignored in the media, northern newspaper correspondence. This is partly Meade's own doing. There's a famous incident with a Philadelphia Inquirer correspondent named Edward Cropsy, not Cropsy, who records Meade's performance at the Wilderness in a way that Meade did not like. I've captured it from the Philadelphia Inquirer for you. Basically, he says the point that really got Meade upset was he says, Grant's presence saved the Army, the nation's too, not that Meade was on point to committing a blunder unwittingly, but his devotion to his country made him loath to risk her last army on what he deemed a chance. Meade doesn't like that line in interpretation. So he brings Cropsy into Army headquarters. He asks for an explanation. Basically, will you recant what you said? Cropsy says no. And infamously, Meade will have Cropsy drummed out of the army. He will put Cropsy on a mule, an ass, backward, and he has a placard that says libeler of the press draped around Cropsy's neck. There's a regimental band that will play a funeral dirge, and Cropsy's literally drummed out of the army. Cropsy will coordinate with other northern newspaper correspondents, and you can read this. It's very evident. They deliberately conspire, let's say, not to include Meade in positive portrayals of the war from here on out. Anything goes well, let's attribute it to Grant. Any setbacks, that's when we'll bring Meade into the picture. Here's Charles Wainwright, famous artillerist. I fear that the general will hurt himself by this, for these newspaper fellows stick very close by one another when an outsider attacks. That is spot on. So by the end of the Overland Campaign, by the end of my talk tonight, the Army of the Potomac has lost 55,000 men. 55,000 men. Killed, wounded, captured, prisoner, missing, since they crossed the Rapidan. It is the bloodiest campaign that the Army of the Potomac has been put through. Their officer corps, field grade, common soldier suffering up and down the ranks is widespread. Second Corps men really suffer in the Overland Campaign. And Grant is going to decide that the best way to get to Richmond is to get to Richmond through Petersburg. And he will move the Army of the Potomac across the James in mid-June and will try to get to Richmond from the south, thus starting the Petersburg campaign. So I want to leave you, and I apologize because I know I've pushed a bit beyond our time frame. I apologize for that. I knew this was an ambitious task to cover all of the Overland Campaign in one talk. I knew it was going to be ambitious. I hope you don't feel like it was laborious or tedious, but I want to leave you with this comment from General Meade. I think Grant has had his eyes opened, and he's willing to admit now that Virginia in Lee's army is not Tennessee and Bragg's. I'll stop my screen share. I'll come back and join all y'all on Zoom. Sorry for running over, but I'll look forward to your questions and conversations on Zoom and in the chat, y'all. Let's do that. There we are.
Wow. Very frankly, until you said you were running out of time, I then looked at the clock. I'm going to use a word and it's not hyperbole either. That was a tour de force. I'm going to feel self-conscious tomorrow when I go to order dinner at the restaurant that I won't be able to articulate well. But thank you. We're looking forward to the 29th. Before I do the questions, I also wanted other groups to know and you to know, our program is carried by a number of libraries here. We do it as a public service. So I should give a shout out to the Washington Township Library, Rockaway, Roxbury, Clemmer Library, Chester, and one of our hosts is Parsippany Library, and I didn't mention Roxbury and Chester. So those are also carried, and our programs are carried on their schedules. So they've been coming in. That's why we didn't know a lot of the names coming in. That's our public service. Let me go through the chat. I saw one chat question, and I'm going to take the liberty of asking you this. How come Meade isn't listed or at Grant's tomb, where they have all the other bus?
Yeah, I'm going to end up with a chapter. My Meade book is going to end up with a chapter on Meade in memory, and I want to look at monumentation and how Meade has been commemorated or not. My suspicion, I don't know this to be true, I see the comment in the chat, is that they are generals of the West. Everyone that you list there is a Western general. If that's a factor on why Meade is excluded, I have to speculate that it is, but that's something in that final chapter I want to look at, Meade's place in memory, how it's obscured or overlooked. And you raise an interesting point on that comment, so thank you for that.
Let me just go through some of the things. It says from Milwaukee, you're going to be speaking in October. Put me on the list, guys. I want to watch the program. I don't care whether it's a repeat or what it is. You could read the phone book. I think I'd pay attention to through that. I loved it. Here was an outstanding. I'm trying to. Thanks, Jen. Look, yeah, please. Oh, the others. Remember, guys, we're going to be on February 29th. Outstanding presentation. I'm just trying to read. Who could read your message? Somebody. I can't see all the messages. I know there was a couple of more messages. So if anybody wants to come on, ask the questions now. But please, one at a time.
Rich, let me read some of the questions in the chat, okay?
Where do you see it?
I'm in the chat, okay. If you were to compare the Grant-Meade dynamic relationship to a later time in U.S. history, what would you give as the top examples, like Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, etc.?
John, I like your comment and your thought. And I study military history. I'm a military historian with a specialization in the Civil War. So I think it's great to find other wars and comparatives and examples. I think you pose an interesting one from World War II, Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton. Patton, though, kind of reminds me of like Warren in a way that he's difficult, isn't he? He's a bit irascible, and that is what makes Eisenhower, in part, such a great general, is he can bring people like Patton and Bernard Montgomery. Wow, talk about an egomaniac, right? That he can manage these guys to the success of a military victory. So I think that's an interesting one. If you were sitting in 1864, though, and you would look, back in history, I don't think there's anything really comparable to how Grant and Meade interact and interplay. And the fact that Grant, that when people say like Grant replaces Meade, that just drives me bananas. Like, he doesn't replace Meade. Meade is still commanding the Army of the Potomac. And I hope this is a big, important part of the book. I hope that my book helps correct that narrative. And we need to look at it, as you're suggesting, as a successful partnership, not a failure, and not of one that's constantly Meade acting as the subordinate, because that's just not the case.
Okay, another question.
Hey,
Did Meade ever recover his glasses after his near capture?
Oh
And
man,
do you know what you, okay.
I
Yeah, go
would
ahead.
I would have to check that. I don't think so. I don't think so. And it's a Virginia cavalry unit that nearly captures him. I'd like to say it's the 10th, but I would have to double check that also. I will say, speaking of lost spectacles, when Meade leaves his headquarters at Taneytown at the Gettysburg campaign, and he arrives to the Gettysburg battlefield late on the night on July the 1st or 2nd, he comes up from Taneytown to the Leicester House. He loses his glasses then. And there's a really funny anecdote about his entourage that escorts him onto the Gettysburg campaign. He gets to the Leicester House about 2 o'clock in the morning. And there's this funny story that one of the members of the entourage described. He loses his glasses, and he's so worried about losing the spectacles that he stops the entire entourage, and he has his aides, this is 1 o'clock in the morning, midnight, scouring around on the ground to try to find his his spectacles. They recover them, and off they go to Gettysburg. So I do know that to be true about the spectacles.
Okay, another question.
Abigail, let me pop in one thing. I wanted Nancy Pirawar is one of our members, and she says the original painting is located said the death of General Sedgwick at the Drake House in Plainfield.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Abby. I'll take another one.
Okay. John Sarna asks, Grant in his memoirs apparently minimizes his role and his responsibility in the setbacks to Cold Harbor. In the context of your talk and from your research so far, what do you think about this aspect of his memoirs?
That's a great question. Grant's memoirs, compared to what Grant writes during the war and how he acts towards Meade or anyone else that he writes about in his memoirs, is a little inconsistent at times. And remember the context in which Grant is writing this, of course, this furious tour de force, to use Rich's phrase, to be completed before he succumbs to cancer. And he's doing it to shape his image, as any of these guys are when they write their memoirs. I don't think he's overly critical of Meade in his memoirs. He, to the extent that he is, he just says Meade's personality is prickly. He doesn't overly condemn his leadership. He doesn't overly criticize his performance on the battlefield. When he speaks negatively about him in his memoirs, it's just more so about him being difficult to work with. His personality is very mercurial, and that's what Grant writes about. And he's right? I mean, he's fair, and you can see how that relationship permeates into all these subordinates that he has difficulties with. So I think on the whole, Grant is fair to Meade in his memoirs, on the whole.
Oh, here's another one, Abigail. It says, after Cold Harbor, wounded soldiers were left on the field for days while Grant and Lee bickers. What were Meade's thoughts about that?
Yeah,
and that's from Brian Cowell asked that question.
Yeah, that's great. They last 3-4 days. I sort of forget when the truce is made, but Meade basically handles that by saying the authority to deal with the wounded has to come through Grant. That's Meade's take on it. That when the exchanges are going back and forth about caring for the wounded and recovering the dead, Meade punts it up the chain of command to Grant. And you might make a case that that prolongs maybe some of the suffering that he literally is following a chain of command in that way, but that's how he deals with it.
To use a military term, somebody asked about when your book's coming out, and I will tell you point blank, we got dibs on you first.
So I'm hopeful. I'll tell you when you all join me next week for Petersburg.
Next month, they're gonna
Next month,
confused.
sorry, next month, sorry, the 29th. 29th, thank you for that corrective. I've just finished my Petersburg material. So I wrote the Battle of Crater, and now I'm moving on to the fall of 1864. I hope that by the end of this calendar year, I will be very close to being done with my writing. All right, the war ends 1865. Meade dies in 1872, so it's got a kind of a quick ending once I get through the war. So I work as consistently and steadily as I can, as I teach and do stuff at the same time with my students. So no one is looking more forward to this being done than me. I assure you that. But I will say I very deeply appreciate your interest in it and your support of my work along the way. That is incredibly uplifting to know that I am writing a book that people want to read. That's huge. So thank you for that.
I know somebody asked a question about, since Meade built our favorite lighthouse before the war, the Barnegat. That's also the one that Andy Waske usually the first week of January appears in uniform.
That's right. That's right.
I think he did the I must have done Absecon and Cape May too. Any other? Yeah, Abigail.
Yeah, we have a question from William Miller. It says you noted early in the presentation that Grant would have challenges in making any decision if it were necessary to replace Meade. Aside from your reference to Warren, do you have any other opinions?
I'm reading that comment too to make sure I understand the question correctly.
Sure.
Challenges in making this. I'm not sure I quite understand. Are you asking for my opinion on Warren, William, in your question? My opinion on Warren or other commanders, maybe?
Do you think he would have gone outside the Army of the Potomac?
Yeah, that's a great question. So maybe one way to answer that is to think about that initial meeting in March, where I started my talk tonight. When Meade and Grant meet for the first time, Grant brings William Baldy Smith with him. Baldy Smith is at the initial meeting between Grant and Meade. Whether or not Grant thought, at least fleeting, that he would put Baldy Smith in command of the Army of the Potomac, you have to wonder. Because what other purpose would Baldy Smith have to be at that meeting? Maybe. Baldy Smith is interesting to me because he performs so poorly in the Army of the Potomac, but he goes out west and he becomes one of Grant's kind of favorites, right? He performs well out west, and then he's drugged back east, and he doesn't perform all that great in Virginia. And ultimately, during the Petersburg campaign, he's going to be dismissed. Grant's going to cut him loose, and that's surprising because he's like one of Grant's, I don't want to say lackeys because that's such a negative connotation, but he's one of Grant's buddies or cronies from the West. So I wonder about that, and I wonder specifically about William Baldy Smith, which would have been a disaster.
Yeah. Let's take two more. Let's take two more questions, and we get ended at 8:30. Okay.
Hey, Rich, can you just ask whether or not Meade was ever in consideration for that list of busts that are in Grant's tomb? I mean,
yes, we did. It was already asked. It was asked.
Oh, what was the answer? I didn't hear the answer.
Working on it.
Okay.
There's a question from Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Kata. Did General Meade have any different attitude of Sheridan's cavalry after the Meade-Sheridan Peppery discourse?
No, he never really reconciles the relationship with Sheridan, and his perception as Sheridan continues to sort of rise through the ranks and be promoted in the regular army, Meade will never reconcile Sheridan. He is a consistent thorn in Meade's side, both practically and then Sheridan's own career trajectory. That is a irreparable relationship. Great question.
Okay. Jim Lynch asked, did any Confederate generals leave an opinion of Meade?
To the extent that I haven't looked a ton at this post-war, I want to keep my perceptions in the war. They tend not lost cause post-war viewed. They tend to be kind of favorable to him. Robert E. Lee certainly respects him. You know, he's comments on that on the outset of the Gettysburg campaign. We have a new commander, you know, he respects Meade. He knows him from the antebellum army. So he's certainly a person that gains and garners respect for his performances on both sides, if not controversial along the way.